and a proud graduate of the MAA program at Houston Christian University. Keith is also currently a Doctor of Ministry student at Houston Christian University. So in a few years, he's going to be Dr. News Anchor Keith Garvin, and we will be even more proud of him than we already are. So Keith is going to come up and introduce Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you, sir. All right. Thank you, Dr. Freeman. I like that title, Dr. Anchor. Okay, I could get with that. Oh my gosh, what a great day it is to be here. I absolutely love this community that is HCU, and to see professors and other faculty members and even some fellow students who have really had an impact on my life. I have to admit to you, I'm a bit under pressure this morning. Not only do I have the honored task of introducing one of the great minds of our time, but we have our first wedding this weekend. Daughter number 2 is getting married, and so the wife has me on a tight leash. She has me on Life 360. She knows my location, and the clock is ticking. So I have to do this right, and I have to do it quick. So let's get to it. It's my distinct honor to introduce you to a man who needs no introduction. And don't you hate when they say that? Because of course he needs and he deserves an introduction, right? Well, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. William Lane Craig and his gracious wife, Jan, earlier this week when I sat in on a class he led at Lanier Theological Library. As a student, I've been assigned books and articles either written or edited by Dr. Craig. As a fan, I have frequently listened to his podcasts, lectures, and phenomenal debates. I also recently discovered that we actually share a birthday. So for all the Leos in the house. All right, Dr. Craig is professor of philosophy at Houston Christian University and visiting scholar of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. He has authored or edited over 30 books, as well as over 100 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. He is the founder and president of Reasonable Faith, which strives in part, as many of you know, to provide an articulate, intelligent voice for biblical Christianity in the public arena. More on its mission and topics can be found at reasonablefaith.org. Dr. William Lane Craig is truly one of the brilliant Christian minds of our time. It's not only a blessing to be in the presence of brilliance, it is a blessing to be in the presence of one who uses his brilliance to give glory to our Heavenly Father. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Lane Craig.
Much, and thank you for coming out this morning. It's good to be with you today. Today we're going to be talking about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and I'm going to be dealing with the facts to be explained, and then my esteemed colleague, Michael Lacono, will deal with the best explanation of those facts. And so we have a nice division of labor here today with regard to the material before us. Several years ago, I was speaking on a major Canadian university campus on the existence of God. And after my talk, one rather irate student wrote on her comment card, "I was with you until you got to the stuff about Jesus. God is not the Christian God." I find that this attitude is very pervasive in Western society. Most people are happy to agree that God exists. But in our pluralistic society, it's become politically incorrect to claim that God has revealed himself decisively in Jesus. What justification can Christians offer in contrast to Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and others, for thinking that the Christian God is real? Well, the answer of the New Testament to that question is clear: the resurrection of Jesus. Acts 17:31 states, "God will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." The resurrection of Jesus is God's vindication of Jesus' radical personal claims to divine authority. So, how do we know that Jesus is risen from the dead? The Easter hymn writer says, "You ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart." I think this answer is perfectly appropriate on a personal level. But when Christians engage unbelievers in the public square, for example, at school board meetings, or in letters to the editor of the newspaper, or in call-in programs on talk radio, or even just in conversation with co-workers, then it's crucial that we be able to present objective evidence in support of our beliefs. Otherwise, our claims hold no more water than anybody else's claims who asserts that he has some private experience of God. Fortunately, Christianity, as a religion rooted in history, makes claims that can, in important measure, be verified historically. So, suppose that this morning we approach the New Testament writings not as inspired scripture, but merely as a collection of documents written in the Greek language, handed down to us out of the first century without any assumption as to their reliability other than the way we would ordinarily treat normal sources of ancient history. You might be surprised to learn that the majority of New Testament critics investigating the Gospels in that way accept the central facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to emphasize that I am not talking about evangelical or conservative scholars. Rather, I am talking about the broad spectrum of New Testament critics who teach at secular universities and non-evangelical seminaries. Amazing as it may seem, most of them have come to regard as historical the basic facts which support the resurrection of Jesus. And that's what I want to summarize for you this morning. These fundamental facts are 4 in number. Fact number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb by one Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish high court. This fact is highly significant because it means that the location of Jesus' tomb was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. In that case, the disciples could never have proclaimed his resurrection in Jerusalem if the tomb had not been empty. New Testament scholars have established this first fact on the basis of evidence such as the following. Number 1, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old tradition quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 5. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." And then he quotes this tradition, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12. Now here Paul uses the typical rabbinical terms, received and delivered, used to describe the transmission of sacred tradition with regard to the information that he's passing on to the Corinthians. Moreover, verses 3 to 5 are a highly stylized 4-line formula filled with non-Pauline characteristics. This has convinced all scholars that Paul is, just as he says, quoting from an old tradition that he himself had received after becoming a Christian. This tradition probably goes back at least to Paul's fact-finding visit to Jerusalem around AD 36, when he spent 2 weeks with Cephas and James. Now, when you remember that Jesus was crucified about AD 30, that means that this tradition thus dates to within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Such a short time span and Paul's personal contact with the people involved make it idle to speak of legend in this case. Number two, the burial story is part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Mark's burial narrative goes as follows. And when the evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also looking himself for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Mark 15, 42 to 47. As you read the Gospels, you find that they tend to consist of short snapshots of Jesus' life, which are loosely connected and not always chronologically arranged. But when we come to the Passion story, that is to say, the last week of Jesus' life, then we do have one smooth, continuously running narrative. This suggests that the Passion story was one of Mark's sources of information in writing his gospel. Now, most scholars already think that Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels, and his source for Jesus' passion is, of course, then even older. When you compare the narratives of the four Gospels, their accounts do not diverge until after the burial. And that implies that the burial account was indeed part of this pre-Markan Passion story. So we have independent attestation of Jesus' burial from two of the oldest sources contained in the New Testament, namely the pre-Pauline formula and the pre-Markan Passion source. And independent attestation from early sources is one of the most important criteria that historians use in establishing the historicity of some event. Number three, as a member of the Jewish court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was extremely strong resentment in the early Christian movement against the Jewish authorities for their role in the condemnation of Jesus. They had, in effect, engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. It is therefore highly improbable that Christians would invent a member of the court that condemned Jesus, who then honors him by giving him a proper burial instead of allowing him to be dispatched as a common criminal. Fourth, no other competing burial story exists. If the burial by Joseph were fictitious, then we would expect to find either some historical trace of what actually happened to Jesus' corpse, or at least some competing legends. But in fact, all our sources are unanimous on Jesus' honorable interment in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics today concur that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact buried in a tomb by this man Joseph of Arimathea. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is, and I quote, one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus, end quote. Fact number 2, on the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the many reasons that have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. Number 1, the empty tomb story is also part of the old pre-Markan passion source used by Mark. The passion source used by Mark did not end in defeat and death, but with the story of the discovery of the empty tomb, which is grammatically of one piece with the burial story. Mark writes, and I quote, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?' And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you.' And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Mark 16, 1-8. And thus, like the burial account itself, the story of the discovery of the empty tomb is among some of the earliest material found in the New Testament. Number 2, the old tradition cited by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, implies the fact of the empty tomb. For any first century Jew to say of a dead man that he was buried and that he was raised would imply that a vacant grave was left behind. The idea that someone could be raised from the dead and yet his body still remain in the grave is an invention of modern theology, not first century Judaism. Moreover, the expression used by Paul, "and he was raised on the third day," probably derives from the day of the women's visit to the tomb, on the third day in Jewish reckoning after the crucifixion. The 4-line formula cited by Paul, died, was buried, was raised, appeared, summarizes, on the one hand, the gospel accounts and the early apostolic preaching in the book of Acts. It is like an outline of both the Passion account and the apostolic preaching in Acts. And significantly, the third line of that tradition, "and he was raised on the third day," in accordance with the scriptures, corresponds to the empty tomb story. So again, we have extraordinarily early, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. Number 3, Mark's story of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. Mark's account lacks any sort of theological or apologetical motifs that you would expect to characterize a later legendary account. All one has to do to appreciate this point is to compare Mark's account to the wildly legendary stories found in the second century apocryphal Gospels. For example, the Gospel of Peter, in which Jesus is described coming out of the tomb, sitting on the shoulders of two gigantic angels whose heads reach up to the clouds, and Jesus' head overreaches the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." This is how real legends look. They are colored by all sorts of theological or apologetical motifs, which are strikingly lacking in Mark's account, which is stark by comparison in its simplicity. Number 4, the fact that women's testimony was less trustworthy than men's testimony in first century Israel counts in favor of the women's role in discovering the empty tomb. The testimony of women in patriarchal first century Jewish society was regarded as so unreliable that, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, it should not even be admitted into a court of law. Any later legendary story would certainly have made male disciples like Peter and John discover the empty tomb. And the fact that the Gospels have women who discover and are the principal witnesses to the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were, in fact, the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the Gospels record what for them was a rather awkward and embarrassing fact. Finally, number 5, the earliest Jewish allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body shows that the body was, in fact, missing from the tomb. In Matthew 28:15, we have the story of the guard at the tomb, where Matthew is exercised to refute the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead." Now, what were the Jewish authorities saying in response to the disciples' proclamation of Jesus' resurrection? That these men are full of new wine? That the bodies still lay in the tomb in the hillside? No, they said the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence of the empty tomb, which is absolutely top drawer because it comes not from the early Christian movement, but from the very opponents of the early Christian church. Now, I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the study of the resurrection, and I quote, "By far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb," end quote. Fact number 3. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is almost universally agreed upon by New Testament scholars for the following reasons. Number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-7, guarantees that such appearances occurred. Paul writes, "He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Paul's list here includes appearances to Peter, or Cephas, to the 12 disciples, to the 500 brethren, to Jesus' younger brother, James, and to himself. Paul's personal acquaintance with these people has convinced virtually all scholars that these events must have actually occurred. You can try to explain them away as hallucinations if you want to, but you cannot responsibly deny that these people did have these experiences of seeing Jesus alive after his death. Number two, the appearance traditions in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of these appearances. As I've already said, multiple independent attestation is one of the most important criteria of historicity. And the appearance to Peter is independently attested by both Paul and Luke in his gospel. The appearance to the 12 disciples is attested by Paul and by Luke and by John. We also have independent witness to Galilean appearances in Mark, Matthew, and John, as well as to the women in Matthew and John. Number three, certain appearances have earmarks of historicity. For example, the appearance to James, Jesus' younger brother. We have very good evidence from the Gospels that neither James nor any of Jesus' younger brothers believed in him during his lifetime. There is no reason to think that the early church would make up fictitious stories concerning the unbelief of Jesus' family if they had been faithful followers all along. Nevertheless, it is indisputable that James and his brothers did become active Christian believers following Jesus' death. James was considered to be an apostle and eventually rose to the position of sole leadership of the church in Jerusalem. According to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, James was martyred for his faith in Christ in the late AD 60s. Now, most of us have brothers. What would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord so that you would be ready to die for this belief, as James did? Can there be any doubt that this remarkable transformation in Jesus' younger brother took place because, in Paul's words, then he appeared to James? Even Gaunt Ludemann, the leading German critic of the resurrection, himself admits, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." End quote. Finally, fact number 4. The original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead, and Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to throw off Israel's enemies, and in this case that meant Rome, and reestablish the throne of David in Jerusalem, where he would command the respect of Jew and Gentile alike. He was not to suffer at the hands of his enemies the ignominious death of a criminal. Number two, according to Jewish law, Deuteronomy 21:23, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God. The catastrophe of the crucifixion for these earliest disciples was not simply that their beloved master had been taken from them, but that the crucifixion showed, in effect, that the Jewish leadership had been right all along, that for 3 years they had been following a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead prior to the general resurrection at the end of the world. Confronted with Jesus' crucifixion, all the disciples could do was to preserve their master's tomb as a shrine where his bones could reside until that day when, at the judgment, all of Israel's righteous dead would be raised by God to glory and they could be reunited with him. But despite every predisposition to the contrary, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely believed in and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, muses some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was, end quote. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, quote, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him," end quote. So, in summary then, there are 4 broad facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars today who have written on these subjects, which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for. Jesus' burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb by his women followers, his post-mortem appearances to various individuals and groups, and the very origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. So now the question is, what is the best explanation of these facts? This is where the disagreement arises. Now, Michael Licona, in his presentation today, will explore some of the contemporary alternatives to the resurrection hypothesis. But let me say simply by way of overview that most scholars today probably simply remain agnostic about this question. They admit that something dramatic, life-changing occurred, but they do not know what it is. But the Christian, I think, can maintain that the hypothesis that best explains these 4 facts is the one that the disciples gave. God raised Jesus from the dead. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, the historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for a given body of historical facts. And the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. 2, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive, despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3rd, it is plausible, given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as God's vindication of those radical claims. 4, it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, namely that God exists. And even that needn't be an additional hypothesis if one already believes that God exists. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't in any way conflict with the accepted belief that people do not rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief just as wholeheartedly as he accepts the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. And number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting conditions 1 to 5. Down through history, various alternative, naturalistic explanations of the facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so forth. Such hypotheses have been almost universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. None of these naturalistic hypotheses succeeds in gaining a significant number of New Testament scholars in support. They simply do not meet those conditions for being the best explanation of the evidence. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a rather desperate situation. To illustrate, a few years ago, I participated in a debate on the resurrection of Jesus with a professor at the University of California, Irvine. He had written his doctoral dissertation on the resurrection, and so he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence. He could not deny the facts of Jesus' honorable burial, empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of those 4 facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him as an infant and grew up independently, but who came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole Jesus' body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly inferred that it was Jesus risen from the dead. Now, I won't bother going into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think it is illustrative of the desperate lengths to which skepticism must go in order to refute the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, the evidence is so powerful that today one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Israel, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel had raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. The significance of the resurrection of Jesus lies in the fact that it's not just somebody or anybody who's been raised from the dead, but it is Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion was instigated by the Jewish authorities because of his allegedly blasphemous claims to divine authority. If this man has been raised from the dead, then the God whom he had allegedly blasphemed has clearly vindicated his claim. The resurrection of Jesus is God's confirmation indicating that Jesus was, in fact, who he claimed to be. But that means that Jesus holds the key to eternal life. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Jesus' historical resurrection is the basis for our hope of victory over death. Hallelujah.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. We are now going to go into a short time of Q&A. Keith is going to MC the Q&A for us for a few minutes. We're going to head out of these doors and into our breakout session starting at 10 a.m. So up until then, we're going to have field questions from the audience about Dr. Craig's presentation. The chapel hosts my breakout session. Most of the other ones are down either of these halls, and we've got many wonderful Houston Chinese Church volunteers that can point you to which breakout session you were assigned to. So without further ado.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. Okay. For questions, we can start. I'll get the microphone to you. Who wants to begin? Okay, we'll go here and then there. I'm going to get to everyone as much as possible. State your name and your question.
My name is Samuel Blackman, and my question is regarding additional facts which might be difficult to explain even on the resurrection hypothesis, including that Jesus, the risen Christ, was not recognized immediately by many of, in multiple occurrences, both the women at the tomb when they encountered Jesus and mistook him for the gardener, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and a few other instances, I believe. Is that a difficult fact to explain on the resurrection hypothesis, or does it challenge it?
Okay, the acoustics in here are such that I didn't understand that question clearly, and so I need you, Keith, to repeat it for me so that I can attempt to answer.
Okay. So I'm going to need you to repeat it so I can then repeat it to the doctor correctly. I was listening, but yes.
Risen Jesus
The,
mistaken by
was he or? So you're asking.
he was mistaken.
Okay, so they didn't recognize the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus or at the tomb. The women did not. So that, is it then difficult to defend? So that the fact that they were unable to recognize Jesus on the road to Emmaus and the women at the tomb as well, does that go against the resurrection hypothesis?
No.
Yes. Does that go against the? Does that go against the resurrection hypothesis?
I don't think so. In the road to Emmaus story, Luke says explicitly that the reason they didn't recognize Jesus is because their eyes were supernaturally held from recognizing him. And then at the moment of the breaking of bread, that supernaturally imposed blindness was removed, and they instantly recognized him. And I think we can assume that probably something like that was operative in the appearance to Mary Magdalene. But in the other appearance stories, like the appearance in the upper room to the 12, there's that non-recognition motif doesn't occur. Now, when you ask, well, what is this non-recognition motif supposed to indicate? What's the theological significance of it? I think it may well be intended to indicate that Jesus is now no longer with the disciples in the same way in which he was during his earthly life. He is now risen and glorified in a resurrection body and an existence which is supernatural and unearthly. And therefore, this non-recognition motif is meant to indicate that he's not going to continue on with them in the normal earthly way that they knew him before, but rather they are seeing appearances of the risen Lord in glory. And that's what perhaps this non-recognition motif is intended to convey to us.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. We'll go here.
Dr. Craig, what was the name of that C.B. McCullough book?
Justifying Historical Descriptions, Cambridge University Press. Justifying Historical Descriptions.
Okay, got that? Okay, next question. Who has one? We'll go here, sir. Give us your name and your question.
My name is Jim. My question is, I fully believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but I was wondering, where is the resurrected Jesus right now, and what he's doing,
Okay.
in your opinion?
Yeah, this is a great question because the doctrine of the resurrection is not that Jesus had a body just for the 30 years or so he was here on earth, but that he carries his body into heaven in the ascension, and that the resurrection is a powerful affirmation of the value of human physicality and of our bodily lives. The Bible does not teach immortality of the soul alone and that the body is garbage to be sloughed off. The body has inherent value, and this is dramatically affirmed in the resurrection. So where is Jesus' resurrection body right now? Well, here's one possible explanation that I find appealing. Jesus' resurrection body only appears physically when he is present in our space-time universe. But the ascension represents his exiting our space-time universe in which the conditions for spatiality and materiality no longer hold. I'll give you an analogy. Imagine a tuning fork that you pluck and you hear a hum by that tuning fork. Suppose you enclose the tuning fork in a vacuum jar and remove all the oxygen. The fork is still vibrating, but there's no sound because there isn't a medium to convey the sound. But if you put the air back in, then the sound will be manifest again. There's no change in the fork. It's still vibrating, but it's not in a medium in which that vibration is heard. Similarly, it seems to me that if Jesus exits our space-time universe, then the conditions do not obtain for the physicality and materiality of his body. But when he comes back again, he re-enters space-time, and boom, his physical body reappears. So I think that that would be a very plausible explanation of Jesus' status right now while he's absent from our space-time universe. I didn't catch that.
He would say that Jesus knows what we are doing, but we don't know what he's doing right now.
Oh, well, that's clear, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's go here.
Yeah. Dr. Craig, my name is Shane Green. So, what you've presented today, most people would call the minimal facts. Do you know the scholarly critical state of the maximum facts for the resurrection?
What do you mean by maximum facts?
Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's more to be said about the resurrection. Like this first person indicated, well, what about this thing? And so I'm asking.
Yes, all right,
Yeah.
fine. What I presented this morning is not the minimal facts approach, because the minimal facts approach, heralded by Gary Habermas and to an extent expounded by Michael Licona as well, doesn't include the empty tomb, or even that fourth element of the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. It's primarily focused on the post-mortem appearances. So my presentation is already more full-orbed than so-called minimal facts. But if you want to add more evidence, in my published work, I would certainly add in a defense of the physicality of the resurrection appearances. I think there's surprisingly good evidence that these post-mortem appearances that I've described were physical bodily appearances, and therefore cannot be hallucinations or merely visionary. So that would just be one example of a more maximal approach.
I think we have time for one more question. You're the closest. If we have time for two, I'll run over there.
Hi, I'm Harold from Australia. So on top of the resurrection, the resurrection body, and you mentioned Paul claimed himself as a witness. How come he and his fellow travelers didn't see him in that encounter?
Yes. The appearance to Paul, as he himself recognized, was out of time. It was out of joint. That he calls it that because it was a post-ascension encounter, you see. Christ had already left this space-time universe. So this was different from all of the other resurrection appearances, which were pre-ascension. And so Paul's experience on the Damascus Road did have sort of semi-visionary traits to it. His fellow travelers didn't experience it as an appearance of Jesus. It wasn't like the resurrection appearances. Nevertheless, Paul can still in good conscience call it an appearance of Jesus rather than a vision of Jesus, such as Stephen had when he was stoned, because there were extra mental accompaniments of this experience, namely the light and the voice that were experienced by his traveling companions. And so in virtue of those extra mental components, Paul can characterize this experience as a resurrection appearance and include himself in the list of those who saw appearances of the risen Christ, even though this was rather abnormal, being a post-ascension experience.
Okay, and we do have time for one more, and our camp pastor has the mic from there. Yes.
Good.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Actually, I know your work a few years ago when a physicist and his wife, a medical doctor, gave me your book. And your work turned them around to be a Christian.
Wow.
Thank God. That was the first. I have two questions here. Number one, what do you think of the Turin Shrouder? That's one question. Secondly, you talking about stealing body. Somewhere I read the Jewish scholars believe this massively. The Jewish historian or Torah scholars believe this angel Michael stole Moses' body. If you ever heard about it, and related to when Jesus was ascending, massive people believe his body was stolen. I mean, these two.
That's very strange. With respect to the Shroud of Turin, I have not kept up with the literature on that since the carbon dating tests came back negative, indicating that the date of the shroud is medieval. But I know that the shroud aficionados are firmly convinced that those carbon dating tests were flawed because they were taken from samples of the shroud that represented later reparations of the shroud using medieval cloth and did not actually test the original shroud, and that certain chemical analyses run on shroud materials show that in fact this is first century fabric. So I've maintained an open mind about the shroud. I think that whether it's authentic or not, its great significance is that it gives us a vivid picture of what Jesus would have looked like in the tomb. It shows the lacerations, the bruising, the beating that this man experienced, and therefore really brings to life, I think, what Jesus endured for us. Now, as for the assumption of Moses and the theft of his body, I think this is referring to Jewish folklore that has been embodied in a piece of Jewish folklore called the Assumption of Moses. And it's referred to actually in the book of Jude, where Jude refers to the contention between the archangel Michael and Satan over the body of Moses. And I think what we can say about this is that this is just fanciful Jewish folklore. It has no historical credibility or value whatsoever. It's just folk tales that arise within Judaism. And I don't think Jude's mentioning it commits him to the historicity of the event any more than if I were to say, just as Robinson Crusoe was aided by Friday in his endeavors, so Jan aids me in my work with reasonable faith. And no one would think that I'm committing myself to the historicity of Robinson Crusoe by using that sort of illustration. So New Testament authors will use illustrations from Jewish folklore and even Greek mythology to illustrate their points, but that doesn't mean they're committing themselves to the historicity of these events.
All right, Dr. Craig, thank you so much for staying
Thank
that
you.
Q&A.
Thank you for coming.
Great questions, everyone. And it is now time for the morning breakout, so it's just a couple of minutes before 10 o'clock. You have time there's coffee, if you want to freshen up, all that good stuff. Dr. Craig, thank you so much.